A few days ago, the French left achieved a stunning victory, with the left-wing New Popular Front winning a plurality of seats at the legislative elections. But while their success might have provided some respite for anti-Le Pen voters, it also means a showdown with the European Commission is pretty much inevitable, who are so anxious about what they see as France's excessive spending habits that a day after the election, they tried to accelerate a so-called excessive deficit procedure against France. So in this video, we're going to take a look at France's ongoing debt crisis and why a showdown with the EU is looking increasingly likely. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So to understand this story, you need to know a bit about France's pre-existing debt crisis. Now, we did a full video on this only a couple of weeks ago, but the TLDR is that in 2023, France ran a budget deficit representing 5.5% of GDP, one of the highest in the EU. In fact, only 3 countries in the EU ran wider deficits last year: Romania, Hungary, and Italy. On top of that, the French government admitted that it didn't expect to reach the EU's 3% target until 2027 at the earliest. And even this feels a bit optimistic, given that public spending is expected to continue growing for the next couple of years. This is why the IMF currently expects France's public deficit to remain above 4% until at least 2029. France's debt to GDP ratio has now also risen to 110% of GDP, the highest ratio in Europe apart from Greece and Italy. This combination of large deficits and a large debt burden has already spooked both investors and the EU. One of the big 3 ratings agencies, Fitch, actually cut France's rating from AA to AA- last year. And then another of the big 3, Standard & Poor's, made the exact same cut. This essentially takes France from the same level as the UK and South Korea to the level of the Czech Republic and Slovenia. But perhaps more significantly, because the French deficit is currently above the EU's target of 3%, and because the French debt is well above the EU's target of 60% without any prospect of decreasing, the EU have opened what's called an excessive deficit procedure, or EDP, against the French government. For context, the 3% deficit rule and 60% debt rule have been in place since the Maastricht Treaty, hence why they're often known as the Maastricht criteria. But they were suspended during the pandemic. The EU did agree to negotiate them to make them a bit more flexible, and the new rules were adopted early this year. But even though the new rules are slightly more relaxed about debt levels and the rate at which debt needs to be brought down, in April the Commission announced that France was one of 11 EU countries in violation of the rules. And then in June it announced that it would be opening the EDP. Now, this might sound dramatic, but EDPs are pretty common. Most EU countries have been through them at least once, and meaningful sanctions have never really been imposed. Usually, they're more a way for the European Commission to monitor a member state's fiscal policy making. And EDPs are often concluded when the relevant member state still has debt or deficit levels above the Maastricht levels, because it's more about the Commission just gauging whether or not that country is a risk to the overall financial stability of the Eurozone. However, there are at least 3 reasons to think that the coming battle between France and the Commission will be a bit more intense than the previous ones. For starters, because of all of its economic and political heft in Europe, the Commission will be a bit more worried about France than other smaller member states. And that's because if something goes wrong with the French finances, that would obviously affect the rest of Europe. The second reason is the sheer size of the French deficit. The 5.5% deficit that France ran last year was bigger than the Commission would like, but 5% deficits aren't entirely uncommon in Europe or the developed world. However, the left-wing coalition that came first in the recent French legislative elections has made it clear that they want to spend a lot more money. They want to scrap Macron's pension reforms, raise public sector wages by 10%, and massively expand the French welfare state. And they plan to fund all of this with tax hikes for the rich. But this hasn't worked well for previous left-wing governments in France. Most obviously, Socialist President François Hollande tried to fund his expansive program by imposing a 75% super tax on earnings above €1 million. But it was so ineffective that he quietly gave up on it a couple of years after it was implemented. If a left-wing government were to increase spending, they would be unlikely to immediately offset it with taxes. This means that the deficit would almost definitely grow. And while 5.5% might just be unpalatable to the European Commission, anything bigger would be wholly unacceptable. But the third and perhaps most significant reason is Macron's centrist alliance and the left-wing coalition are going to be hyper-resistant to any spending cuts, because they worry that austerity will fuel the ongoing rise of Marine Le Pen's National Rally. One of the reasons the Commission have never needed to impose meaningful sanctions is that governments are usually pragmatic enough to heed their advice. The next French government, however, is unlikely to be so pliant, and we can sort of see why. Politically, it's not a great look if a left-wing alliance is voted in, promising a massive popular expansion of the welfare state, only to immediately U-turn because the Commission says that you don't have the fiscal space. You get the idea then. The EU is uncomfortable with the amount that France is spending, but spending less would be a gift to the National Rally, so Macron and Mélenchon are unlikely to do it. And if this deadlock isn't resolved, the Commission could technically fine France 0.05% of GDP, or about €1 billion every 6 months. And the European Central Bank have signalled that they could also exclude France from its new untested bond buying programme. But while this would be really politically toxic, much of the French electorate and political class are already wary of what they see as the EU's needlessly austere attitude to fiscal and monetary policy. And corrective measures from the Commission would stoke Euroscepticism and make the EU look like a handmaiden to the far right in the eyes of the centrist and left-leaning voters. As a final thing, if the ECB were to punish France somehow, this would accelerate their repoliticization. Now, we're not going to go into too much detail about this here, but many European politicians, including Macron, have recently floated a new growth target or decarbonisation target for the ECB, and stated that the ECB need to do more to help Europe through this period of crisis. But any corrective measures here would probably invite yet more scrutiny from France and elsewhere regarding its role in Europe's political economy.